Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 29th of January, and today we're looking at a wide array of updates, beginning with the situation in Velyka Novosilka, as you can see over here. But we will then look at Andriivka, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and Pokrovsk. So it really is an interesting video. We're going to begin by looking at the Russian capture of the remaining northwestern part of the town, 3.3 square kilometers, that occurred on the night of the 25th, going into the 26th of January. But if you haven't already, please like and subscribe so you can grow the channel. You can see that the main units involved in this operation were the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade, and 5th Guards Tank Brigade. They played a big role in capturing these residential areas, including private houses, gardens, and basements in the northwestern chunk of Velyka Novosilka over the past couple of days. And they were involved in cleansing the final remaining pockets of resistance that the 110th Brigade was putting up. So the 110th Brigade, as we all know, was sent in as a vanguard force to help allow the rest of the Ukrainian forces that were operating in the town and the nearby suburbs to escape. And so all other units that you see over here on the deployment map, they did not experience any difficulties when it comes to encirclements. Of course, they did suffer significant attritional losses, whether it be in terms of vehicular losses, but to a lesser degree, more so in terms of manpower losses in a lot of these cases, but they were not physically cut off and either taken POW or killed during the final days of the battle. That really only happened to vanguard elements of the 110th Brigade. So not to the entire unit, of course, but to say a couple of vanguard companies that were able to hold the flanks for just a couple more hours or days in order to allow other forces from the same brigade or from other ones to withdraw. There's at least one video of a group of 4 Ukrainian soldiers talking about how they had been completely cut off and they were not presented with any opportunity for an escape route from the Ukrainian local command, and they were just told to resist until the end, basically. And so that's one example of a physical encirclement. There's also examples of Russian soldiers walking around these houses and filming deceased Ukrainian soldiers. But again, we're looking at, if you're going to count each specific body and each specific soldier captured, we're looking at several dozen. We're not looking at hundreds or anything more than that. And that's because of the significant human losses that the 110th Brigade experienced over the past couple of weeks in its efforts to hold on to the remaining flanks and to then also maintain a direct line to the rear through the several rivers. Due to that commitment, they were able to prevent any sort of final culmination of a significant amount of soldiers being killed or captured, but the actual losses, human losses, did accumulate day after day during the entire course of the battle. And that's actually something that is significant. It didn't just happen in one fell swoop. So that's something to keep in mind about the lack of videos coming out. But from the Russian perspective, they now captured the entirety of the town and have already begun to capture nearby fields that are just to the north or to the west of it. What I'm really interested in looking at is what will occur next in this sector, because you do have a very strong Russian garrison here, the same Russian garrison that was involved in the capture of Vuhledar, which was a pretty large Russian success, routing the Ukrainian forces in that town. And since then, they've been on a streak of just consistently capturing a lot of medium-sized towns from Ukrainian forces that have been sent in as reinforcements, and they have been able to exploit weak points in the Ukrainian line and to penetrate pretty deep into the Ukrainian rear in areas that previously had not been anticipated. Looking at this highway over here, for instance, all the way to Zolotoniva, that was done by the same Russian garrison that is now captured Velyka Novosilka. And you also have parts of this Russian grouping that were involved in extremely heavy clashes against Ukrainians that had concentrated a lot of firepower, not necessarily manpower, but firepower in this parts of the Mokryali River Valley. So now they have all this experience from really both sides of the conflict, whether it be high-paced penetrations or this sort of grinding attritional warfare over a couple of houses. So now they have all of that packaged into one within this grouping. So it is a really experienced grouping with momentum on its side and a significant manpower mismatch in terms of it having probably upwards of 40,000 troops in comparison to the Ukrainians having maybe 15,000 in this location. Of course, we're talking about on paper. I don't know exactly what the rates of capacity are for each unit, but that's just my estimates. And so you could see over here the Mokryali River continues northwards. It's still on low elevation, obviously, all the way to Kamar, a really important logistics point. And you could see that it's also on low elevation. It connects to roads that extend eastwards to Andriivka, extend northwestwards to the border with Donetsk, where you have Havrilivka, a really important node garrison. And then also, you could say, go southwards to Velyka Novosilka. So, a really important point right now that acts as a conduit between the Dnipro region and the current front line for the Ukrainians and whatever remains of this sort of western portion of Donetsk Oblast. And that is just the natural next target for the Russian side. The Ukrainians are hoping that due to most of the other brigades, besides the 110th being preserved, the 110th took the most significant toll, and it's sort of garnered a reputation for being used as a sort of fall guy, whether it be in the Avdiivka region, where it played a big role in acting as a vanguard unit, or around the Vavcha River. And now over here in Velyka Novosilka, this is the third time around, and this time it's actually one of the most serious when it comes to the losses. But in any case, the other units over here, like 2 battalions from the Presidential Brigade, they're still operating. Here you have artillery elements and infantry units from the 141st Mechanized Brigade. So they're going to hope that they can establish the solid line based on the fact that they have control over this key height over here, this ridge west of the Mokriali River that I'm marking with this sort of just red outline, and it extends northwards all the way to the Khomar region. But on the flip side, the Russians also have control of parts of the sort of eastern ridge bank of Velyka Novosilka. You can see it over here. It extends into Ukrainian territory as well, but it's largely in open fields where the Ukrainians are not really projecting any sort of power when it comes to like mortars or attacks on the Russian side. But you do have the 23rd Brigade over here, Ukrainian unit that is pretty strong in comparison to the other ones here, and they are just consistently targeting Russian forces located in Rozdonia to prevent them from acquiring the momentum needed to advance northwestwards and then put pressure directly to the east of Khomar, because that is a legitimate fear now that Velyka Novosilka has been unlocked by the Russian side. So the Ukrainians, their hope is that they're going to be able to stabilize the front line now that they at least are falling back to some trenches and to some areas on ridges, and they can take advantage of the fact that the Russians are not going to coalesce around Velyka Novosilka to sort of try to maximize their elevation advantage, because Velyka Novosilka is at the lowest point. It's in between two different rivers, and that's also going to make resupply into this region difficult for the Russians. But just remember, Velyka Novosilka is not an island. There are nearby ridges that the Russians also have control over, where they're also going to be able to achieve parity with the Ukrainian side. So I really don't know how much of an effect the elevation will have in helping the Ukrainians stop a Russian advance over here. But I do think from a Russian perspective, they should not be stopping in this location, because there is a serious possibility of the Russian garrison over here in Velyka Novosilka uniting with the one that is pushing currently in Andriivka. And then it would also just connect together in the Khomar region and a bit to the north at the border between Dnipro and Donetsk. That is a serious possibility going into spring, I would say. But over here, you can see that the Ukrainians are continuing to fight tooth and nail to maintain control over Dakhnia. There are heavy clashes going on over here. This is clear proof that the Russians captured zero point 0.6 square kilometers of territory, primarily in the southern parts of the town. But now you have two prongs of fighting to the north, where it was reported by Deep State that the Russians have this penetration over here. And now, based on geolocated data, you have over here on this is from the 102nd Motor Rifle Regiment. They broke through the Ukrainian lines and entered into Dakhnia, engaging currently in house-to-house fighting with the 46th Air Assault Brigade. So the course of these clashes will determine whether the Russians take it over in its entirety. Because if the Ukrainians can't hold on to the southern flank, and the center will no longer be protected, and the Ukrainians will have no other choice but to withdraw the remaining forces. That would be an issue, because where else would they go to? There's no other organized settlements for them to fall back to, unless they're willing to go back all the way to Olakli, which is already really close to Konstantinopil and Andriivka itself. And if you look at the gap, Ulakli right now is about like 5 or 6 kilometers away from the line of contact and from Dakhnia. And so that would be ceding a lot of territory to the Russian side. And they wouldn't cede it immediately, because there are anti-tank ditches and trenches, but it's just not going to be effective long term, not even in the short term, because eventually those groups are going to be overrun, not sustainable for a large amount of Ukrainian infantrymen. And so the Russians already have experience with these sort of deep penetrations through open fields. And that would sort of spell the end for this pocket that has been sort of giving a bit of insurance for the eastern flank of Andriivka. But right now, Andriivka's most immediate worry is on its northern flank, as I've been really warning about for months. I've talked about the possibility of the Russians just completely undermining any Ukrainian investment in the eastern flank of Andriivka by attacking from the north. And that's sort of what they've done ever since capturing Slovyanka and Petropavlivka. They've been expanding consistently westwards at really fast paces. And there's nothing the Ukrainians can do from a manpower standpoint because they don't have sufficient amounts of ground forces, assault companies in these locations to push back the Russians directly from each individual low valley region or tree line. What they are doing is utilizing FPVs to the maximum in the same way that they did in Velyka Novosilka, where actually the Ukrainians are pretty much on FPV and artillery parity with the Russian side. In this region, I would say that the Ukrainians probably are stronger when it comes to their drone usage than the Russians, and that the Birds of Magyar regiment, for instance, or elements of other parts of the 30th Marine Corps are really heavily involved in striking individual Russian soldiers advancing. You can see over here the capture by the Russian side of a lot of excess pockets where there were probably small amounts of Ukrainian forces just trying to buy time and distract the Russians from their main goal of pushing westwards and then hooking down southwards to Andriivka itself. But now the Russians have coalesced, capturing 3.7 square kilometers over here. That is a significant amount. And then here, 2.3 square kilometers of territory. They're now getting very close to taking the entirety of the fields east of this vertical highway. And there has been no record of the Ukrainians that are in the center of this town pushing back the Russians from the northern outskirts. This was from January 25th. We talked about it. The Raid Battalion, which is an FPV group, they struck Russian soldiers entering into a house over here. But since then, there's not been any proof of the Ukrainians re-stepping into this location, just physically taking it back, which is what's necessary. FPV strikes are sufficient in order to increase Russian casualties, but it's not going to be enough at a certain point in time to prevent Russian territorial advances in some of these regions. It has to be coupled with the FPV drone, specifically with a Ukrainian ground maneuver. And in some regions, we're going to actually see that the Ukrainians have been able to do this effectively, but in this region, they have not been able to yet. And the Ukrainian garrison over here probably was not ready for this. They were either focusing on areas to the east when it comes to Dakhnia itself, or they were involved with clashes a bit further to the north in Yasnov and Novandrivka, where there actually are a lot of difficulties right now. And so I don't know how much of a high preparedness the Ukrainians over here had. And I don't know which Ukrainian groups are specifically tasked with the defense of Andriivka and which units are just sort of on the rear and just happen to be in Andriivka due to the continued withdrawals, because there is a bit of a difference. But you do have here some territorial defense units, you have elements of artillery units, but mainly TDF brigades, not necessarily mechanized units, which is what you would be hoping for. For instance, the best unit in this location would be the 37th Brigade, coupled with the 79th Air Assault Brigade, and they're more so involved with the southern flank of Andriivka, not necessarily with the town itself or with its northern flank. So that's something to keep in mind going forward. But over here, you could see I don't even know what I would refer to it, just sort of the hinterlands between the front line and the border with Dnipro Oblast. In the direction of Novopavlivka, of course, which the Ukrainians have a definite interest in building up at the moment. They won't have that much time if the Russians get any closer to build it up. So now would be the best opportunity to do so, even though it is only 15 kilometers away from the front line. It's better to really significantly build it up now than at any other time in the future. Over here, you have Russian advances that led to the capture of Novoandriivka, which amounts to 3 square kilometers of territory captured by the Russian side. There were then attempts to enter into Zribne, and I think some Russian sources have claimed that they're in the southern part of Zribne, but so far I've not been able to verify that. And over here on January 29th, you had a combined assault by the 2nd Battalion of the 153rd Jaeger Brigade, I think they're called. Not mechanized, but I think they're Jaeger. In any case, they were coupled with the 91st Anti-Tank Battalion, and they conducted a counterattack on a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle advancing along this road in particular. They dismounted at this tree line. They fought in close quarters combat with the Russian side and were aided by drone drops using grenades, and were able to push back the Russians a couple of hundred meters eastwards and prevent them from directly entering into Srebrenica. But this also confirms to us that there is a Russian presence in the rest of Novoandrivka. So now the line has sort of just stabilized along this sort of vertical route over here containing its tree line. So all eyes will now be on the southern flank of Srebrenica. A bit to the north here, the Russians have captured additional territory that is south of Novoyelizaveta. This is 2.4 square kilometers of territory. And this is all part of a broader measure of capturing just open fields in the hinterlands or outskirts of certain villages, because you have over here lower elevated areas, for instance, than Andriivka Valley, I would refer to it as. And then over here, of the Srebna Valley. The area in between is actually on a pretty high elevated hill and also to the south of Srebny. So these are just great areas for the Russians to take control over if they don't sense that there is immediate Ukrainian resistance. And then from there, they can build up and just use it as a vantage point or varying spots onto the Ukrainians that are in pretty concentrated areas in these small villages like Nadivka, where they are putting up significant resistance and trying to hold back the Russians. And this is mainly being done by the 153rd or 151st Brigades. I'm not sure which one. But again, over time, it compounds and it becomes difficult to defend such a small area, especially because it is so disconnected from the rest of the Ukrainian front line, from the rest of the Solona River line, and from other rear bases like Novopavlivka or Mezhova. But over here, you can see for now that the center of Nadivka has not fallen yet to Russian hands. Now, to look a bit to the north, we have over here a bit of ambiguity surrounding Kotline. The Ukrainians definitely have moved in reinforcements to hold on to at least the outskirts of Kotline, the outer perimeter of it, because they understand that any deeper Russian advances will then precipitate a larger Ukrainian withdrawal, either voluntarily or just due to Russian physical pressure. Because look at it, I've explained this numerous times, and it's going to become clear as we go forward, but there aren't any other areas wherein the Ukrainians could take set of pitch camp and resist against the Russians for a long-term drawn-out clash besides this mine shaft over here, this mine production facility. That's the only area they can still defend through, and it's sort of the next on the chopping block for the Russian side after they get Udachnya. And so the Russians have now been focusing on just clearing out remaining Ukrainian targets on the perimeter of Kotline, including this shaft over here and these structures that were captured. And now what remains is just a couple of tree lines where there are still Ukrainian squads operating. Also, a bit to the east, the Russian forces have been able to enter into some of the first lines of trenches that are protecting the western approaches to Pokrovsk. You have three lines that are just running south of the rail line over here before you reach the main perimeter trench sort of bastion that the Ukrainians have. You could see how it just circles around the entirety of Pokrovsk. And so you could see there was a lot of investment put into defending the city from all directions, but primarily from the eastern direction, not as much from the south or from the west. But nonetheless, there are still targets over here and obstacles that the Russians are trying to traverse. So they have been able to capture 40 hectares of territory. And at the same time, the Ukrainians counterattacked and took back 1 square kilometer of territory. This is from a video released a couple of days ago, but the metadata says that it's from January 19th. It's a video from a Skala assault regiment. They dismounted their own forces and squads within southeastern Kotline along the T046 highway. They were able to fire with the Bradley that they were using towards Russian positions in these houses, and then were able to get out and acquire some additional territory. But since then, there's not been a clarification as to whether the Ukrainian counterattack expanded deeper into Kotline, into other residential areas. But for now, we know there is still some sort of Ukrainian resistance coming from this eastern flank. And it's all being done because the Ukrainians understand that if they just stay laid back, there's not going to be an option at some point but to withdraw even further back. And so they're opting for the more proactive approach of conducting counterattacks and trying to retake some crucial areas. And so that's what's being done in Kotline, for instance, and it's why the front line is sort of stalled over there for the Russians over the past week. A bit to the south over here, you can see the Russians captured some territory east of Pischane, amounting to 0.6 square kilometers. This includes this trench over here, the entrance to a windbreak near a rail line, and also just further outskirts south of Zhvirova and north of Shevchenko. The Russians have captured, really chipping away at these residential areas that are actually not protected by the trench line that surrounds Pokrovsk, as I said before. You can see there's a bit of a gap in the line between the northern and southeastern parts of Leontivichi. So that's an area that the Russians could theoretically bypass, but they would have to do so by fighting through some residential areas. Now, looking here to the north of Vozhizhenka, this is from a couple of days ago. This advance, actually, I think it's from yesterday, as reported by Deep State, but it amounts to 0.9 square kilometers of territory just east of Baranivka, advancing primarily near the Bichok River, but also expanding westwards to a higher elevated location. The Russians have been able to capture a local stronghold, creates another sort of salient where the Ukrainians are in an uncomfortable situation due to two protruding Russian attacks, leaving the Ukrainians really in sort of a fire back, and also helping the Russians approach nearby villages like Berezhivka and Volyane Druhe, defended by the 111th Territorial Defense Brigade. So this is zero point 0.9 square kilometers. And then looking eastwards at the Toretsk region, you could see over here the Russian forces, they've captured the entirety of Leniadivka. This amounts to 2.2 square kilometers of territory, including fields south of the village, where we have this video here from the 12th Azov Brigade and the Donetsk Police Battalion of FPV strikes onto Russian Ladas as they were advancing through open fields, trying to attack towards this particular trench. That's the current Russian objective, to just eliminate some of these outer trenches and strongholds that are preventing the Russians from achieving a deeper penetration either to the west to like an area of Romanivka or Sukhabalka, or then to sort of circle back and attack the flanks of Novospaska. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, it's interesting that there were so many Ladas and private vehicles being utilized by the Russians in the specific part of the front line. It's been a trend that I've seen increase in recent months, and not just private vehicles, but also vans. They're used a lot by Russian soldiers over here in extremely dangerous parts of the front line where FPV drones are just dying to get their fingers on those vehicles. So here's just another one of a Russian Lada getting destroyed by a mine on January 28th, further solidifying proof that the Russians are operating in the entirety of the village. Now, when it comes to Toretsk, the Ukrainians continue to resist despite increasingly heavy pressure in this pocket. That is, let's see how much it spans. It spans like, what is that, 4 kilometers deep into Russian territory. That is really difficult to maintain. And there's been recently strikes by the 56th Special Purpose Battalion onto Ukrainian holdings in the water filtration station over here that I'm circling over. And over here, you can see the part of the salient has been chipped away at. Due to this capture of 25 hectares by the Russian side, they've been able to take over this local slag heap and some remaining parts of the Zabalka district. But there are two more blocks that remain under Ukrainian control that the Russians are looking to cleanse over the coming days. And then over here, you can see that west of Krimska, the Russian forces have captured additional houses. Again, just sort of final clashes where now you have significant Ukrainian resistance. They're trying. What I mean is that the Ukrainians want to prevent the Russians from establishing a solid base in the northern parts of Toretsk that then can be used to attack further northwards into Dakhnia, Dilivka, and take away all of these remaining dense trench lines and valleys and just geographic obstacles that are being used to just hold out this sort of eastern buffer zone to prevent Konstantinivka from becoming the next center of Russian operations. So that's just a part of the thinking of the Ukrainians. That's why they're just conducting these localized raids, pushing back into the northern outskirts, not staying there permanently, but just coming back to attack a Russian grouping that is advancing, to drop off a large mine to destroy a certain house. And in areas where they are remaining, that would probably be around Krimsky, the northern part of Krimsky. There were a couple of houses still under Ukrainian control where the fighting is dragging out, and also in this residential area south of the rail line. There are still Ukrainian forces, of course. There's a few other units that I want to mention that I've just recently been seeing a lot of. You have over here the Dnipro 1 National Police Regiment, and there's a few others, all of them coming from the National Police elements. So all of them are just deployed together in this specific location. Probably makes for more cohesion, but they're not a part of the armed forces of Ukraine. So there is a bit of a difference in their fighting styles. Over here, you can see this is the Russian advance just south of the slag heap near the factory in western Krimska. There was also a localized counterattack by the Ukrainians near this local warehouse where they were able to capture, I believe it was 6 or 7 Russians POW. And that was a part of the raids that I was discussing previously, where the Ukrainians are not actually trying to solidify control over there and retain a beachhead, but they are just trying to push the Russians out of sort of like excess areas and then withdraw to their own comfortable positions. In this case, it would be around this local slag heap, which remains under their control, despite the sort of cornering of it, as you can see, with the Russians present both to the east and to the south. And now to move on to the final piece of territory for today's video, we're looking at Chasiv Yar. You have over here the Russians capturing 1.5 square kilometers of territory. You could see this geolocation from January 28th of Akhmat elements capturing the Yuzhny Sakip. This included the killing of 8 Ukrainian soldiers during heavy clashes to overrun several dugouts wherein the Ukrainians were situated at the peak of the Sly Keep and were continuing to fire towards the Russian side. They also try to use FPVs and shelling to target the Akhmat soldiers, and then in turn, the Akhmat elements use their own grenade drops onto the Ukrainian side. So you had just a back and forth clash over there, but in the end, the Russian side was able to capture this higher elevated region, and they were also able to take the administrative building of the Chalk Quarry. I think it's called Number 9, and parts of the quarry in the northern parts at least, and now they're actually getting pretty close to some of the residential areas in southern Chasiv Yar that are more rural in nature, and also entering into Stopochki, which is very important as it is one of the final villages along the T0504 highway before you reach Andriivka itself. So that's something to keep in mind, but it also plays a big role in the course of the Battle of Chasiv Yar, because now you have this very strong Russian southern flank that could then exert pressure onto Mykolaiivka and onto the core of Chasiv Yar. But when it comes to Chasiv Yar itself, we don't have any clarification on the southern part of the core. It appears that the Ukrainians have been able to maintain control over here and push back Russian assaults deeper into the apartment buildings. This is mainly being done by the 24th Mechanized Brigade. But then over here, we have this interesting geolocation from January 27th from the Ukrainian side, the 24th Brigade. They filmed a dead Russian soldier, and this was in the center of Chasiv Yar. This is past the refractory plant and past some of these warehouses all the way into the actual residential areas. And this proves us that the Russian forces were able to infiltrate deeper than we initially thought, at most infiltrating 400 meters deeper than was and still is depicted on my map as under Ukrainian control. I can't really change the mapping based on one photo of one dead Russian soldier, but that does give us pretty good indications that this area is more fluid than I have depicted on my map. I can't really account for it now, but it does mean that we should be waiting and seeing whether the Russians are able to now push deeper and reach some of the residential areas and actually begin to establish permanent bases of operation there. Because it seems that now the sort of shift is in the direction, despite the heavy Ukrainian resistance that is occurring at the entrance to the core of Chasiv Yar. And so that's all I have for today. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.